All right, welcome back. I don't think I have to tell anybody, but in case you just joined us and you haven't been watching anything that's going on in the world, which I find to be, Chauvin is now is in jail. He's awaiting sentence in 8 weeks. He is looking at a massive amount of time. But remember, there's still 3 other officers because the case was severed, split apart, that are supposed to go to trial. I believe it is in August. And one of the attorneys for one of those former police officers, Thomas Lane, is Earl Gray, who also represented Kim Potter, the former police officer who is involved now with a manslaughter charge with regard to Dante Wright's shooting. Let's hear an interview he did on CNN that was given a while back with respect to the representation of former Officer Lane.
He did everything that he thought he was supposed to do, and he did more than that. He went into the ambulance, and he's the one that was doing CPR. He's a man of compassion.
Okay, so there you go. He's a man of compassion. That's good for TV. It's not necessarily, Tammy, going to be working in a court of law. But let me ask you, this is a little bit different. If I recall the facts of this case, Lane was one of the people that was holding down Mr. Floyd's legs during this encounter. Obviously, there's not that visual. I mean, I think it's really hard for a jury to get past that visual of Chauvin's knee on the neck. And keeping in mind that these are junior officers, and Chauvin was the person, and they're very chain of command-y police officers. Chauvin was the one that was calling the shots based on how their chain of command works. How much harder is it for prosecutors now that we kind of know their case? Because in this one, they have to even include an additional element of aiding and abetting. What do you think?
I don't think it's going to be extremely difficult because the charges that they bring against Mr. Lane is probably just going to focus on those elements that can be met. Did he, leaning on Mr. Floyd's legs, contribute to his death in conjunction with Mr. Chauvin's knee on his neck? So we can split apart those 2 separate actions of those 2 different officers. It doesn't matter how experienced Mr. Chauvin was and how less experienced former Officer Lane was. His actions of still being on top of Mr. Floyd, who clearly was not resisting, could have contributed to his death, and the prosecution is going to definitely continue to make that argument, and the defense will continue to try to raise some type of doubt. But the doubt that they raise in that standard of beyond a reasonable doubt is going to have to be contingent on which charge the prosecution is going to focus on. And they're probably going to focus on a charge that they feel confident in obtaining a conviction.
And what are your feelings with respect to the cases that are against the other officers, King and former Officer Tao? Tao was the one who was actually keeping the crowd back, and I don't believe had any physical encounter with Mr. Floyd. More difficult of a case for prosecutors there?
Not necessarily, because as you know, officers have a duty to intervene whenever they see another officer behaving in bad behavior, excessive use of force. Those officers also have a duty to render aid to citizens, and clearly Mr. Floyd needed aid. He was screaming out for aid. And during the trial, we heard the testimony from the paramedic that continued to repeat that Mr. Chauvin would not move off of Mr. Floyd's neck, even when he was there to render aid. So despite that officer only trying to keep the crowd back, he still had a duty to respond.
Yeah, and we also talked about the defense expert before, Barry Broad. Let's take a listen to some of what went on with respect to that, because I find it kind of fascinating and interesting, this person.
Leave.
Roll him on the side.
No, leave him. Just stand put where you got him.
Stop.
All right. Now, at that point, you could hear somebody in the background, correct?
Yes.
You heard Mr. Floyd, true?
Yes.
His voice appeared slower than before?
Possibly.
Thicker than before?
And what?
Thicker?
Yes.
Right. You also heard conversation, normal tone conversation between Officer Lane and the defendant, correct?
Yes.
Officer Lane said, roll him on his side, right?
Yes.
And what was the defendant's response?
Something not yet.
Okay. No, keep him here.
Okay.
Right? Okay. And so at this point, Officer Lane is suggesting that they roll him on his side. Would that be consistent with the side recovery position?
Yes.
Okay. And the defendant is rejecting the side recovery position at this point. True?
Yes.
He's hearing his information from this fellow officer, deciding a different course of action. Nothing the crowd's doing is preventing them from having that conversation. Is that right?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And in your view of the clip that we just looked at, just focusing on the subject behavior, what is Mr. Floyd doing? What was he doing in that clip?
He's becoming more compliant.
Well, is there any non-compliance you were able to see in that clip?
In this clip, no.
And so he's not exhibiting non-compliance, and based on your testimony and your review and the plain video record in front of you, you see that the defendant has not changed his position, correct?
Correct.
He's still applying the same level of force that he did at the beginning of the restraint period, true?
That I can't say.
But he's still kneeling on Mr. Floyd, correct?
Yes.
And you're not contending this was some sort of an accidental position, right? He didn't fall down onto Mr. Floyd, and he was purposefully kneeling on him.
Yes.
True? Okay. All right. And so, based on your view, right, of the defendant being on top of Mr. Floyd, up to this point and beyond this point, the defendant did not alter the level of force that he was using on Mr. Floyd, did he?
No.
Even though Mr. Floyd, by this point, had become, as you put, compliant. Fair?
More compliant, yes.
Well, what part of this is not compliant?
So I see his arm position in the picture that's posted.
Right.
That, you know, a compliant person would have both their hands in the small of their back and just be resting comfortably, versus like he's still moving around.
Did you say resting comfortably?
Or laying comfortably.
Resting comfortably on the pavement.
Yes.
At this point in time, when he's attempting to breathe by shoving his shoulder into the pavement.
I was describing what the signs of a perfectly compliant person would be.
So attempting to breathe while restrained is being slightly non-compliant?
No.
No.
Oh my, Tammy, you know, this is the cross-examination of the defense expert. Like I said before, shredded. I think he was the best witness for the state. And sometimes that's what happens, that you actually can cross-examine a witness to your advantage. But I mean, when he said resting comfortably on the pavement, it gave everyone this like, oh no. You cannot possibly have gone there and said that. His credibility on that alone, not to mention all the plethora of other things, was extraordinary. What did you think when you heard that? I mean, you could see the incredulity on the prosecutor's face when that comment was made.
I thought it was gross. It's disgusting. And I don't know why the defense decided to bring him in as the use of force expert. Perfectly compliant to who? In whose eyes? From him? This is a Black man. He's seen things happening in the country repeatedly, and he literally predicted that he would be next by the statements that we heard him say. When this expert actually stated perfectly compliant. What is perfectly compliant whenever you're getting arrested and you're on the floor with somebody's knee jammed into your neck for almost 10 minutes? No, that is ridiculous. And I think that the prosecution, like you said, definitely were, you know, pleased with his not so great performance as an expert.
Yeah, if they had time, it's a pop the champagne moment. But one other thing that he got this witness to say, which I couldn't believe, and at one point the witness just caved. They were just saying yes to anything the prosecutor asked. He had that witness wanting to just get off that witness stand, but I think it was very compelling. It's the aha moment in the case. I really believe that it comes down to this. It comes down to Chauvin's knowledge about the condition of Mr. Floyd when he was saying, my neck hurts and my body hurts. And it's kind of the intonation of, you know, like, so he hears it. The witness testified it was Chauvin who said it. I'm not sure how he knew that, but that's what he testified to, and it wasn't contradicted. That's really bad. And as far as that the crowd was distracting you and you weren't able to determine what was going on. What were your thoughts on the aha moment?
Bob, that man was just chilling with his knee in his neck with the crowd there, and the crowd is screaming at him, and he's just there, hand in his pocket, staring at them like, what? I'm not going to move. I'm not going to do anything. They're literally yelling at him, get him help. Like I said earlier, the MMA fighter, he called the police on the police. because he's literally just sitting there. So that is definitely the aha moment. And I'm just glad that there's going to be some justice for George Floyd, his family, his daughter. Let's remember he has a daughter, and the community and the country at large. And unfortunately, you know, like I said earlier, we're going to continue to see these types of things. But, you know, this is just a mess.
You know, what about Lane, though? Let's go back to, again, a junior officer trying to maybe put him in the side recovery position, goes into the ambulance, supposedly he's trying to resuscitate him, because I think that was a big thing, that there's 3 minutes that go by where we know from the pulmonologist, Mr. Floyd is gone. And for 3 additional minutes, no medical attention is being given to him. But does the jury give Lane a little bit of a break that he tried to do something?
They might, you know, it depends on how the prosecution brings their case, and it depends on what the defense attorney is going to bring up for the jury to consider giving former Officer Lane a break. You know, I will say that there might be some doubt, depending again on what charges are brought against him. There could be some doubt so that there's not that beyond a reasonable doubt standard met. Mr. Lane did say a couple of times, you know, he's trying to keep the crowd back. Can he, you know, get him on his side position, to which Mr. Chauvin said not yet. So that is some type of attempt. And we all know what it's like to have, you know, a workplace where there's a superior. And he was a junior officer. He was listening to an officer that was way more senior to him. So, you know, any good defense attorney would elaborate on that and really focus and key in on the disparity between the amount of time Officer Lane was on the force and the amount of time Officer Chauvin was, in order to raise that doubt to Officer Lane's contribution to Mr. Floyd's death.
And some of us trial lawyers have been talking for a long time, Tammy, with what would have happened had these defendants all been tried together, what effect that would have had on the outcome of the case. But listen, you know, one thing I know me and you completely agree with, nobody better than our law and crime team that was out there, including Angenette Levy, who's done some great work for us. So we're going to take a quick break, and on the other side, we're going to find out what the atmosphere is like out there in Minnesota. We'll be right back. Okay, we have a situation. Of course, everybody wants to be able to get in the middle of what happened here after the verdict. We've had a lot of political people that have wanted to comment about this case, including some Minnesota district senators. Let's listen to one of them.
I'm not speaking no rhetoric. I'm just black in the state of Minnesota, and it sucks to be black here. Knowing damn well that I watched my friend, I talked to him about Alton Sterling on June 5th. July 5th, July 6th, the very next day he lost his life. Here we are, we mourning George Floyd. We can't even mourn George Floyd and another officer killed somebody in Brooklyn Center. Right. And so like my sister Tashira said, until we get justice for all families, there will be no peace. We're not going nowhere. And we're going to keep our knees on legislation's neck, on all of the legislators. I'm putting y'all on blast. You know, I got elected into this office to tell the people the bullshit y'all doing inside of them buildings.
Yes. Either you represent the police unions or you represent the people. You can't do both.
You cannot do both. You cannot do both. We are dying like sheep. Yes. They're hunting us down like deer. Racially profiling brothers and sisters left and right. Your tail light out. Your brake light out. You didn't turn your blinker on. Your windshield wiper don't work. You're driving while black. You got an air freshener. Ultimately, those traffic stops turn those cars into caskets for black people.
We got legislation this week to stop.
We got legislation this week. This week, we propose legislation to try to stop these pretextual stops. Senate don't want to hear it. So when we talk about police reform, I want y'all to be on notice. Who is stopping police reform in this state? It's the Republican Senate, and I'm not scared to say it. Hey, can I get y'all one time, everybody? Just one fist up, 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 one fist up. Reporters two, one fist up. This one for George Floyd, y'all. Say it with me one time. Guilty, guilty, guilty. One more time. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Come on.
All right, obviously a lot of emotions with this case. There's no question about it. Angenette Levy from the Law&Crime Network got double scoop today. We have her in a recorded interview, and now we got her live. Angenette, I mean, you see that going on, and a lot of people very agitated, happy as well. What is the temperament and the feeling like out there right now?
Hey, Bob. It's good afternoon to you and to everyone at home. It's like a chilly day here in Minneapolis, not too bad, and it's very calm. It's very quiet, much different than it was yesterday. The only real activity we've seen over at the Hennepin County Government Center was a group of activists holding a press conference talking about the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland announcing a probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. Those activists said that this is something they've been asking for years and not getting. They've just gotten other advice from the Justice Departments and things like that. So a very different mood than yesterday. It's very calm, and I think it's just because this city has been under a lot of tension. It's almost been a little bit of a pressure cooker, and that tension, that pressure was released yesterday with the news of those guilty verdicts coming down against Derek Chauvin. Now, one of the people we actually spoke with yesterday was somebody who was going to be a key witness for the defense in this case. You may remember Maurice Hall. George Floyd's girlfriend testified that she and George Floyd, she called him Perry, would sometimes buy drugs from Maurice Hall, and Maurice Hall was in the vehicle, in the SUV with George Floyd when the police approached that night last May, and he was detained by police while Floyd was taken into custody, and they tried to put him in the squad car, and we all know what happened from there. So I just ran into him on the street, and we spoke with him for quite some time, and he talked to me a little bit about his friend, George Floyd. To the club with him or to the truck driving? You said he drove a truck too.
Yeah, he drove trucks. And what I did was we rented a hotel room so we can be closer to the company. But I definitely would go on the weekends to the clubs with him. It was a Latino club, so we didn't really like the music, but we enjoyed being able to relate with each other, you know.
So you were there at the club with him. Had you ever seen Derek Chauvin at the club before?
You know, I've seen Minneapolis policemen. I never saw that guy personally, I don't think, but I mean, I've seen them up there. They're supposed to be up there for the crowd to kind of usher the crowd along and help get them out the streets.
Did you know, do you know if George Floyd, your friend, and Derek Chauvin knew one another from that work at the club?
I do not.
You don't know. And that was really a big question throughout this case. You know, in the very beginning, there were some news reports from somebody saying that Chauvin and Floyd did know one another from working at that Latin club. Chauvin worked off-duty details outside while Floyd was security inside. The person who made that statement then retracted it days later last year and said, no, I was mistaken. They didn't know one another. But we still have never really gotten a definitive answer to that question. Did they know each other from working at that club? Now, Maurice Hall, the gentleman from whom we just heard, has his own legal troubles right now. He invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege during the trial. He didn't want to testify because he may have put himself, if he had answered truthfully, according to his attorney, at risk for being charged with third-degree murder, counterfeiting, and other charges. So that was stated twice in open court. He did not testify for the defense in this case, and he has his own legal cases, some felony cases here in Hennepin County and another one in Redwood County for sex trafficking and some other charges. He's hoping to have all of those wrapped up by June, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Bob?
Angenette, if I understood this case, both the defense and the prosecutors had him on their witness list. The prosecution obviously decided they didn't want to call him, and the prosecution also would not grant him immunity. I've always been wondering, did the defense try to get the prosecutor to grant him immunity or ask the court to grant him immunity, or did the defense just say, okay, the state's not going to grant him immunity, so he's not going to testify and just move on?
Well, I don't know if Eric Nelson asked the state to grant him immunity, but Eric Nelson said in his opening statement he was going to call Maurice Hall to testify about George Floyd being asleep in the vehicle and not being able to rouse him before the police approached. So I don't know whether or not the judge, I think in the case stated, if I recall correctly, that he couldn't grant him immunity, and that wouldn't cover him for immunity on federal charges, even if the state did grant him immunity. And there was really no incentive for the state to grant him immunity. They didn't want him on the stand because that would have given the defense something to possibly hang their hat on as far as Floyd, their claim that Floyd really died of a drug overdose. If Maurice Hall was in the car and admitted to providing the drugs, which the prosecution believed could be true, Matthew Frank said that in court one day, that would have given the defense something to go on with their case, and the state wasn't going to help them out with that.
Yeah, Angenette. Well, it is supposed to be a search for the truth, and I've had confronted this very issue myself. I've complained about it. People want to talk about criminal justice reform. We should reform it to allow defense attorneys to at least seek immunity from a court so they have access to the witnesses that they can defend their clients. It's not just this case. There's cases all throughout the country where this is going on. I was a prosecutor, but it gives prosecutors a lot of control. Angenette Levy, thank you so much. Always doing a great job. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.
You got it. All right, Tammy. So let's go back to the elected official that we had saw just before that. What are your thoughts about the comment that I'm paraphrasing, can't support the police and the community? Do you agree with that?
To a certain extent, I do agree with that. I think that Representative Thompson, the state representative, was speaking with a lot of passion, a lot of hurt. It's something that a lot of us in the African community are speaking, subsequent to this verdict yesterday. It still hurts. It hurts because there's still individuals that are dying. Just yesterday, as we were getting the verdict, Ma'Khia Bryant, murdered by a police officer. Here in Texas, Tatiana Jefferson, she still doesn't have a trial date. Aaron Dean murdered her in October of 2019. So whenever that representative spoke with so much passion and said he's going to be kneeling on the neck of legislation for change, I felt that. Just yesterday, I was at the Southside Community Garden in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're still calling for a trial date for Aaron Dean. So these types of injustices that we see repeatedly over and over again, it hurts. And I think that Representative Thompson was making a point, and it is something that all of the American people need to pay close attention to. This verdict is a step in the right direction, but it's not the solution to reform until we start talking about it clearly and openly. And there's a solution on both sides of the aisle without politics involved.
Okay, excellent commentary. I really appreciate that. We got more Law and Crime coming back. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back with this fascinating case, and it's really just the beginning because there's so much more to go in terms of the sentencing and the three other defendants that are facing trial here. But Derek Chauvin is now in jail because he lost the presumption of innocence once the jury came back with guilty on every count. But a lot of people are giving a lot of thanks to Daniela Frazier, who was one of the main witnesses in the state because of the video that she posted that went viral, getting a lot of thanks and kudos because a lot of people believe if it wasn't for her, the courage to tape, the courage to post, that this case would not have turned out potentially the way it was. And we'll explain that in a minute. Let's take a little watch of her testimony on the witness stand.
And you were also asked questions about how, as the events went on May 25th, how you and others may have gotten louder.
Correct.
Darnell, are you the sort of person who, in response to seeing somebody being potentially harmed on the street, gets louder?
I'm more of I bottle things up. I feel things inside. I have social anxiety, so it's really out of my comfort zone to really be that out person. But when I saw, at moments I was loud.
Loud in response to what you saw?
Correct.
Now, Mr. Nelson asked you a few questions about your video going viral and how that's changed your life. Remember that at the end?
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen how your viewing experiencing what happened to George Floyd has affected your life?
When I look at George Floyd, I look at my dad, I look at my brothers, I look at my cousins, my uncles, because they are all black. I have a black father, I have a black brother, I have black friends. And I look at that and I look at how that could have been one of them. It's been nights I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting and not saving his life. But it's like, it's not what I should have done. It's what he should have done.
Yeah, Tammy, this is a compelling witness on so many different levels. One, she's 17 years old when this is going on, so that goes to that aggravating factor for purposes of sentencing. Two, she had the video of videos that precipitated this whole thing. A very demure, by definition, quiet person, and she actually blames herself. I get goosebumps when I think about it, that she didn't physically get involved. She blames herself for that. And, you know, the prosecutors made a very good point about how helpless these bystanders were because they respected authority, that they didn't intervene. And that was a great message to say, yet the cops who were the authority, they didn't intervene either. How much do you think that video was important to this case even being brought and securing a conviction?
That video was life-changing for her, as they mentioned, but I think they were trying to get some other type of response for her, as if she's, relishing in fame and glory because she took the video. No, she, like she testified, she has social anxiety. She's not the person that would even step in, but she has nightmares about the fact that she didn't do more. I think all of us, when we first saw that video, we wanted to jump through the screen and do something, push him off. So imagine how she's feeling day after day when she's thinking about the fact that she was the one holding that cell phone, but she couldn't do anything more. And you mentioned, that the crowd respecting authority. I don't necessarily think it's a matter of them respecting authority. I think it was a matter of them being fearful of them being next, them being the next person that's on the ground with a knee shoved in their neck. Because at this point, and what we've seen in this country repeatedly, is that whenever somebody does intervene, they're facing some types of charges, or they're facing the ground similar to George Floyd. But that video is crucial. Imagine if we had that type of video back when Emmett Till was murdered, when countless other Black individuals were murdered. So for her to have shot that video, just kudos to Ms. Frazier, her courage, her willingness to even share and speak up against what she saw happen because she knew that it was wrong.
Yeah, and look, very, very good points. And they can't get involved, and you're right, because otherwise they're going to be called defendant too. And who knows, when you're watching them choke the life out of another human being, you don't want that to be you. So I can imagine that the anxiety of that. Do you think that those anxiety-provoking positions that these folks were in, especially her who created this video, will weigh heavily on the judge's decision as to sentencing?
I think so, because all of that was brought up with the prosecution and, with defense trying to raise doubt. It just, in my opinion, it just didn't work. And obviously it didn't work in the jury's opinion. So when it comes to the judge going by those sentencing guidelines and really focusing on whether he's going to go with that upward departure or not, similar to the testimony of the 9-year-old, he's going to consider the testimony of Ms. Frazier and the trauma that she's endured since shooting that video. I think that the defense asking how her life has changed in a way that was almost as if she's relishing in that fame. To me, it's like when we think about Trayvon Martin or George Zimmerman signing Skittles bags after what happened. I believe that they were trying to create that type of analogy, and it was completely inappropriate and wrong. And as you stated, her demeanor on the stand showed and confirmed what she said, that she has social anxiety and she's not the type of person that would even get involved in anything, but she knew that she had to.
Well, you know what's interesting, Tammy, we talked about this offline a little bit. It's what some refer to in the business as creative police report writing. So we're going to show you a graphic right now, and I'm going to read it to you because we saw the video, but let's take a look at the report. On Monday evening, shortly after 8 p.m., Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department responded to the 3700 block of Chicago Avenue South on a report of a forgery in progress. Officers were advised that the suspect was sitting on top of a blue car and appeared to be under the influence. 2 officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He's ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. At no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in the incident. So Tammy, it seems to be, you could write those reports any way you want, but it just seemed like all of a sudden he suffered a medical event and there was absolutely no intervening cause or resisting with respect to being put on the ground, the knee and the neck. That video belied, it's not what you put in there, it's what you didn't put in there that was the relevant part of the case. What you didn't put in there is the thing that led to a murder conviction of Derek Chauvin and 3 other officers who have now been fired who are also facing murder convictions. What you didn't put in there were the accurate facts that you're supposed to be putting in there in police reports. How often does this go on in your mind, the quote unquote creative police report writing?
Creative police report writing, Bob. It's the lie for me. It happens often. Like, if we don't have these types of videos out here where average citizens are courageous enough to shoot the video, what are we going to have to combat against this creative police reporting or alternative facts or whatever way we want to dress up the lie of these individuals, covering themselves? As a former prosecutor, I'm sure you can appreciate what we all talk about, the CYA, creating that paper trail to, make sure that what we are doing or what other people are doing is correct and accurate. But the videos and more people becoming more comfortable shooting the videos, I think that's going to combat against that creative police reporting. This conviction on all 3 charges is going to combat against the alternative facts. So I do think that these lies that these officers make, and not all officers, don't get me wrong, not all officers, these bad apples, I think that they're going to second think whenever they're doing this creative police reporting.
I think, Tammy, from all my years of doing this and having led 44 police agencies in my career, Jersey did some reform. I was on the task force that did this, that if you got caught falsifying a police report or leaving something out of a police report, or your credibility was ever assailed for having lied on a witness stand, you no longer have a job. You no longer can be an effective police officer, because that has to be turned over to the defense for every single time that happens, which basically makes that witness ineffectual. So I look at it from that standpoint, that would be a great an actual criminal justice reform piece. But I think this case speaks to a larger thing. I think it speaks to the idea that police officers around the country are going to realize that this kind of like, hey, I'm not the one who did it. There's some creative police report writing, but it's not my responsibility, are going to start to say, you know what? No, this is my responsibility, and I don't want to be charged with a crime or lose my job. And if something's not accurate in a report, I'm going to bring it forward. Do you think we're going to start to move towards that place?
No, not until we address the bigger issues. You and I both know that these officers aren't just going to lose their jobs. So, fun fact, in addition to me being a former federal prosecutor and presidential pardon expert, I also was a senior attorney at the Federal Bureau of Prisons doing employment law. So whenever these officers, who are typically protected by unions, have the union support, that whenever they do get disciplined, like Mr. Chauvin was disciplined, they're going to file a grievance. The grievance goes to arbitration. There is a lack of diversity of representation of the arbitrators. And a lot of times, the employer is not able to meet that just and sufficient cause standard to allow that employee either to have the discipline or to remain terminated. That's how we see these officers getting their jobs back after egregious behavior. So not until we address what's going on with these police unions, as Representative Thompson mentioned in Minnesota, I don't think that we're going to see reform as it pertains to this type of conduct by police officers, because these officers are able to get their jobs back because they know they can lean on the protection of their unions. And that's something that a lot of people don't talk about because a lot of people are unaware.
You know, Tammy, back in the day when I started practicing, I'm going to date myself now, confessions of defendants did not have to be video recorded. And it never ceased to amaze me how every single case I got as a prosecutor, the defendant confessed, they waived their rights to remain silent, and there was nary a problem with regard to the legality of those confessions. But once they started requiring that they be videotaped, I'd say 90% of the Miranda rights that were read, people would ask equivocating questions. They would say no, they wanted a lawyer. They'd keep them there. They'd give them a soda and a hamburger. Hey, this will go eat. They just weren't respecting it. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist. Before the cameras, everybody confessed and Miranda was perfectly fine. And afterwards, 90% of them were problematic. I kind of feel the same way is happening with the body cameras and the creative police report writing, because you can't hide from it. And I just want to emphasize, I'm interested in your commentary about that, but I agree. Most of the police officers are doing an efficacious, decent, and good job. And it has always been my position, and Mr. Ellison said this, and the prosecutor said it in the case. This is also a case about supporting the police, supporting those who are doing the job correctly, supporting those who are being truthful, supporting those who are following the policies and procedures. Thoughts on any of that?
Yes, Bob. Like I said earlier, not all of the officers are bad. Like, we saw these officers come up and testify for prosecution. They flipped on their own, So at the end of the day, we still need to see this type of reform. We need to see more officers ready and willing to speak up against those bad apples. I can never remove myself from the 12 years at the Department of Justice. That's law enforcement. So of course, I definitely acknowledge and I respect the officers that do the right thing. But I also was privy to a lot of information with my experience in seeing how it happens that an individual that is disciplined or even fired is able to come back and be on the job and be in a situation like Mr. Chauvin, to where he has the ability to murder someone. And it's not okay, and it's something that we need to talk about on all levels, from prosecution, defense, attorneys, to the police officers, and also to unions and the arbitrators as well.
Yeah, been on a lot of panels, but I think the biggest impediment to it, by the way, is the fact that the very brass that spoke out against Derek Chauvin, to the point that the U.S. attorney is making, and the point that was made by Mr. Crump in the civil rights complaint, all of a sudden, you who were in charge of everything from training policies to Derek Chauvin's internal affairs record, all of a sudden now have had this epiphanic understanding of what is going on out there. I don't know, call me crazy, but I think that was a little bit more CYA, in my opinion, with all due respect.
I agree with you, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, come on, give me a break. Anyway, if I were the defense attorney, I'd say they should be sitting there as officers, not that they were actually involved in the incident, but they created Derek Chauvin. All right, listen, we got Brian Ross on the other end of this break, who had an interview with Doug Jones. It's going to be fascinating, so please stay with us. We'll be right back. Brought justice. You guys may remember former U.S. Senator Doug Jones with regard to the KKK attack on the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Decades later, talking to our very own Brian Ross about how to bring racial and social justice, a cause that he has been very, very dear to his heart when he was a federal prosecutor as well as a U.S. attorney at the time. That's really a great interview that Brian got. Let's take a listen.
It was a dark day in American history, as immortalized by Hollywood.
See, she parts in the middle, and then...
A bomb planted by Ku Klux Klan members killed 4 schoolgirls in 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and highlighted the difficulty in the struggle for racial justice. And justice only came decades later, thanks to the efforts of then federal prosecutor and future U.S. Senator Doug Jones. And we're joined now by former prosecutor Doug Jones and former U.S. Senator. Doug, thanks so much for joining us. You made history with the prosecution in Alabama. How do you think the trial of Derek Chauvin will be regarded by historians in future years in terms of the ability to find social and racial justice in this country?
I am hoping that this is going to go down in the annals of history as a significant event. Because if Derek Chauvin is convicted, it will be in large measure because of the breakdown in what they've called the blue wall of silence. It is very difficult. I can tell you, as both a prosecutor, as defense lawyer, it's difficult to convict a police officer, law enforcement officer, of a criminal act even when there is a death occurred. And so what we've seen in this case, I believe, is not just the outcry and the cries for social justice that was prompted by the death of George Floyd, but what we've seen in this trial in particular was a very methodical way that the prosecution laid out a case, and they used police officers, his fellow police officers on that Minneapolis police force, to make the case that what he did was outside not just the norm, but outside the bounds of the law. So that's where I believe this case is really going to have some significance for law enforcement and for justice. What happened with George Floyd really changed some dynamics around here. You know, the pandemic really put a spotlight on the racial disparities that we've known existed in this country. Though there's a lot of folks in this country who just didn't see it that way until they saw those images.
Doug, what specific reforms do you think are required or necessary for policing in this country?
Well, there's a couple of things, Brian, and I was a co-sponsor when I was in the Senate of the George Floyd Police Reform Act. It's passed the House of Representatives twice now. It died in the Senate. It never got a vote in the Senate. I think that transparency is very important. I think having a registry of some type that these law enforcement excessive force allegations that are made can travel with these folks. Finally, I think we've got to look at the obvious things, the no-knock warrants, the chokeholds. Those need to be taken away from law enforcement. They're not necessary. And finally, we're going to look at whether or not qualified immunity needs to be stricken.
And finally, from the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing to the Derek Chauvin trial, do you see progress, real progress, being made in terms of the search for social and racial justice?
Have we seen that? Yes, we have seen it. But we have also seen some serious backsliding in the last few years. It stems in everywhere from voting rights to law enforcement. I think what we have seen in the last 4 years in particularly, we've seen a lot of public officials, including the former president of the United States, using what we in the South call dog whistle kind of rhetoric that kind of gives a green light and a rise of white supremacy that is taking over. People need to stand up a little more and stand up, speak out, and cause a little good trouble, because we have got to move this country in a way that everyone is equal, everyone is treated equally and fairly in both business, society, and especially our system of justice.
All right. Former U.S. Senator, former federal prosecutor Doug Jones, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
That's an amazing interview, Brian. Thank you. Tammy, I mean, wow, we go back to the history of all of this. And, you know, I can't help but look at the political lens of what we've seen in the past couple of years and how politicians are at each other's throats and no meaningful reform can happen in any way, shape, or form. But I will say this. Some of the most hardened people I know that are police supporters saw what occurred on that tape with George Floyd and were, in fact, shocked by it and surprised. And I think that that's part of the thing. I'm interested in your thought, that people don't see it. They don't realize it. They hear about it. But when you look at it, what you see there, none of anybody that I spoke to thought that that was a, quote unquote, good look. They thought it was terrible. Does George Floyd make a significant difference in moving people's opinions in the right direction?
We would hope so, right? Bob, you and I are on the same page. We would really hope so. But even what I've seen in some of these Facebook community groups from my fellow attorneys questioning the jury coming back with a guilty verdict on all 3 counts is disgusting. Unfortunately, it's not a situation where everyone agrees. It's not a situation where everyone has that sigh of relief that, wow, the jury actually found him guilty of all 3 charges, the anxiety and, you know, the memories of seeing George Zimmerman get off and countless other individuals who have murdered unarmed Black men and women. In this situation, unfortunately, there are a lot of individuals that still seem to think that Mr. Chauvin should not have been found guilty. Regarding the interview with Brian Ross and the former senator, I think that you know, I respect them and their positions and their careers. However, being two white men speaking about social justice and racial reform, it's not going to hit the same way as it's coming from someone that's actually in that underrepresented group, that actually can talk about their personal experience, their professional experiences. When we talk about there being a change from that bombing, right? And now with the Chauvin trial, things change. But it hasn't changed completely because it's a different type of change. It's a different type of discrimination and bias that we see.
I want to thank you. I just want to make a host prerogative. I want to wish my wife a happy 20th anniversary. Like my dad said, the best thing you could do in law is marry the right woman, and I did, and I'm blessed for it. Law and Crime Daily next. Stay with us.